Everyone.
Do you guys want to take this in?
I'm last.
Welcome to our panel tonight. I'm John Connolly. I'm the director of International Space University's Southern Hemisphere Space Studies program, and I'd like to welcome you all here. Space is not a peaceful place, regardless of what you see in the movies. Sometimes asteroids, solar flares, and other space hazards are ever present and threaten us here on Earth and pose threats to the many satellites in Earth orbit that we depend on daily. Our panel tonight represents some of the space professionals who have spent careers both supplying us with telecommunications and other spaceborne services, and who are now looking at how to keep those services and us safe. So before we begin, I'd like to share a quick thank you to our host, University of South Australia, for welcoming us here to SHSSP16. I'd like to thank my co-director, Michael Davis, sitting in the back there, and all our sponsors that you see coming up on the slide every so often. I'd now like to introduce our moderator for this evening, Dr. Joe Pelton. Joe is the former Dean of International Space University and Director Emeritus at the Space and Advanced Communications Research Institute, George Washington University. He's been with ISU since its very inception back in 1987. So if you want to know anything about how this university came to be, Dr. Pelton is the one to ask. From 1968 to 1987, he held various positions at Intelsat and ComSat, overseeing the boom days of satellite telecommunication. He's a widely published author with over 33 books, including one that many of our students here have, The Farthest Shore, a 21st Century Guide to Space. Joe is also the founder of the Arthur C. Clarke Foundation and remains as vice chairman of its board of directors. Please help me welcome Dr. Joe Pelton.
Good evening, welcome. We're really pleased that so many of you could come out to listen about the exciting, interesting area of space security. Many of you may be wondering, what is space security? And the thing is, it covers a wide range of topics. It covers the issue of tracking missiles and other things that go bump in the night, like orbital debris, and then the situational awareness to be able to track and keep track of that. It's also the issue of cosmic hazards, and actually I've just done a video about new concerns about the change in the Van Allen belts and solar events that could wipe out our grids as well as take out our satellites. So there's many, many aspects of this. But the interesting thing, I think, to you is that a lot of this relates to Australia. There is a new radar system being implemented in the Pacific in the Kwajalein Island atoll, but there's now some thought about putting an additional space fence in Western Australia. There also is a firm in Australia that's very key on optical tracking called Electro-Optic Systems, and they've just formed a partnership with Lockheed Martin, a major aerospace provider, and they are going to provide on a commercial basis tracking of orbital debris and other things that we need to keep track of in space. So a lot of this relates directly to Australia and things that Australia is directly involved. And we have three of the world's experts that are going to discuss all of these aspects, including, I think, Ray Williamson is going to be addressing some of the practical issues of space security, like interference, radio interference between satellites and the orbital crowding that is a threat to some of our commercial operations. So all of these things we put under the umbrella of space security. And Ray is someone that I've known for a long time. I first met him when he was in the Congress, the U.S. Congress, in the Office of Technology Assessment. And then we worked together at George Washington University, where he was a key figure in the Space Policy Institute. And then he moved on to play a very key role in this, the Secure World Foundation as the executive director and then as a senior consultant. He's done many things, but he is truly an expert in remote sensing, and he's going to give us kind of an overview of what space security really involves. So Ray, please.
You might know that I didn't have this ready to go.
Squeeze it,
All right,
right?
there we
Both
go.
sides.
Got it. Okay. Now that should work. Can you hear me? Good. All righty. Mark? Where is that thing? Sorry, the... okay, got it, thank you. Thanks. All right. Okay. Sorry to throw a bunch of PowerPoints at you at this hour of the night, but I thought it might be the best way to get the points across and show some visuals as well. So basically, I want to talk about, generally about security in space, dealing with some of the things that Joe Pelton just mentioned, and also tie that into the question of sustainability in outer space. We have a serious issue going forward into the future of can we sustain our activities in outer space, particularly in low Earth orbit. So there's what I call a threat to sustainability. It's a long-term threat, but it's an important one. And we should begin to think about it now. Then I'll talk a little bit about issues in governing outer space, and then just briefly mention space situational awareness, which is an important component of this. So first, the definition, and this is my definition. I convinced Secure World Foundation to take this on as well when I was director, using outer space in such a way that all humanity can continue to use it for socioeconomic benefit and peaceful purposes. And then, in order to reach sustainability, we need international technical, policy, and legal cooperation in the world. And we need agreements from the countries involved, which is most every country in the world, in one way or another, designed to ensure that outer space is safe, secure, and peaceful. So what is happening today that we need to be concerned about? Increasing number of space actors with multiple systems in orbit at different levels. Debris from the normal day-to-day, year-to-year operations. Debris fragmentations. If left long enough in orbit, old satellites and rocket bodies and so forth begin to break up in orbit and cause debris. By the February 2009 accidental collision between an operating satellite, an Iridium satellite, and a defunct Russian Cosmos satellite. And also by anti-satellite tests such as the January 2007 Chinese anti-satellite test. And then also by the use of other space weapons in the future, if they should be used. This is just a quick look at the growth of debris in orbit. If you see this line here is where the Chinese test, and then the Iridium-Cosmos collision. So you can see the big bumps there. If we continued this further, we'd see a decline in the number of debris in orbit because debris at low levels washes out and back into the Earth's atmosphere, and most of it simply burns up. Some comes back to Earth and bounces on Earth or into the ocean. But a lot of it just stays in orbit for years and years and years. If it's high enough, it may stay there for centuries. And space sustainability is also threatened by frequency interference. Some of it is accidental because in the geosynchronous orbits, you have the communication satellites, especially close together, and a lot of those may interfere with one another accidentally, and there may be deliberate interference, whether for political or other reasons. Sometimes from ground-based systems, sometimes from space-based systems. And then another issue that Joe mentioned was natural space weather events that occur, solar flares and coronal mass ejections, these large clouds of solar particles that come off the sun, and if the Earth happens to be in the way of those big clouds coming away from the sun, it can affect our satellites in orbit, and also, by the way, affect the electrical grids around the world, causing disruption to them. So the challenge is to devise and adopt a set of international best practices, in my view, that guide operations of space systems and make them the activities more sustainable. And then the other challenge is to devise ways to make civil space situational awareness, in other words, where all the debris is, where it's going to, what's the predictions of the path of each individual trackable piece, and try to avoid the collisions where possible. And then if you put those together, you might have the possibility of a space traffic management regime that would increase the safe and efficient use of outer space. And in my view, sustainability will require a very good system of space situational awareness that's international. It includes minimizing the creation of new debris, stabilizing the existing population, and then minimizing the impact of debris on operations. And all of that rests on good space situational awareness. So we also need to limit the creation of new debris. And there's, the UN has acted back in 2007 to develop a set of guidelines. Unfortunately, they're only voluntary, so states have to agree that they're going to follow them and actually follow them. And then we also need to add additional controls on the creation of debris. So each country, needs to develop mandatory rules within the state that would go into the state laws and regulations to limit the creation of new debris. And many states have done that. Others need to do it in the future. And we also need some sort of agreement that there be a prohibition on debris causing anti-satellite weapons. So, and then finally, conducting research on methods to improve existing debris and adopt policies to support those methods. The hardest part is developing the policies and understanding what those policies should really be. And with that, I'll stop here, except that I'd like to show a short video. Got it. There we go. Now, what you're looking at is the debris looking down from the pole. So you see this ring around here. Those are the geosynchronous satellites that sit on the equator. And now it's turned so you can see the ring. You can also see the debris in low Earth orbit, all these little bees buzzing around the Earth. Note, by the way, that the debris that's depicted here is depicted much larger than it really is. We're talking objects that are 10 centimeters in size or greater. So, but it's really striking to watch this. And one of the key things is that you see there are some certain patterns, but there's also a lot of randomness in it. And that's one of the difficulties with orbital debris. And here you can see that line, which is right there, which is the band of geosynchronous satellites and debris right along here. And then across, sorry, I misspoke. Right across here are the polar orbiting satellites that we've heard about several times so far in the lectures that go near the pole. And one of the concerns is that crowding near the pole may cause us problems in the long term. And then finally, we'll go back to see the equator projected out into the satellite field and the geosynchronous satellites and debris. And finally close down with this, where we started with systems, debris and satellite systems over the poles. Okay. So thank you, and we'll do questions later.
Right.
Right?
So, you know, I mentioned earlier this new space fence, and what's significant about it is that we'll not be able to just see things the size of a tennis ball, which is enough to wipe out a satellite, but it will be able to track down to the size of a marble, 1 centimeter in size. And the frightening thing about that is that when that's operational, people say we'll probably be able to see 250,000 to 500,000 of these. And there's a study from Europe that basically said by 2020, that number will probably be 1 million. So one thing is going up there and getting a big satellite and bringing it down, and we need to do that. But the real question is, how do you deal with 1 million of these marble-sized elements of debris? So next we have with us a very, all of our speakers are very knowledgeable and so on, but Tyson Sarah is currently the Assistant Secretary for Strategic Policy in the Department of Defense for Australia. During his time with the department, he has worked in Strategic Policy Division, International Policy Division, Corporate Services, the Australian Signals Directorate, and the Australian Geospatial Intelligence Organization. He has served in a number of positions in the Defense Strategy Group, most recently as the Assistant Secretary for the Pacific. A lot of duties and responsibilities, and he will give us, hopefully, another perspective on what space security is all about.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me. Yes? Good. Well, good evening, and thanks very much to the University of South Australia and the International Space University for giving me the opportunity to come and discuss the importance of space to defence and national security and some of the challenges that we face in maintaining Australia's access to space-based systems. As Assistant Secretary for Strategic Policy at the Department of Defence, I have the responsibility, among many other things, to develop Defence's policy position on our use of space and our interests in outer space. Australia and the Australian Defence Force are highly reliant on the use of space-based systems for a number of services, and as the importance of space-based assets to the conduct of military operations grows, Defence will need to pay close attention to the vulnerabilities of these systems. This presentation will focus on the integral role that space plays in the lives of Australians, how Defence use of space has changed the way that we operate, some of the challenges that Australia faces in maintaining access to space, and how we can act to preserve security and stability in the space environment. Space-based systems are an intrinsic part of everyday Australian life. They have transformed the way we communicate, navigate, predict weather patterns, conduct commerce and access information. A day without access to space-based systems would be a day without access to some of the conveniences we currently enjoy. For example, satellite television would not be working, your in-car GPS would be useless, as would the GPS-assisted navigation on your phone. International banking, which relies heavily on the accurate timing provided by GPS satellites, would also grind to a halt. And if you lived in a more isolated community, such as the town of Maree in northern South Australia, you'd find yourself unable to access mobile communication at all, and your internet and television access would be non-existent. You might even find it hard to get a beer at the Maree pub due to the dependence of global supply chains and payment systems on space-based networks. As you can therefore see, retaining access to space is something that can affect all of us. Our high level of reliance on space-based systems is the product of necessity, convenience, and the unique capabilities that space-based assets provide. Australia's expansive landmass and wide population distribution makes secure landline communication systems capable of meeting the needs of all Australians difficult to construct and maintain. Satellite communication is therefore a reliable and cost-effective alternative for some of Australia's more isolated communities. Space-based systems allow all Australians to have reliable access to communications regardless of their location. Environmental monitoring and surveillances are difficult given Australia's large size. As such, data obtained by Earth observation from space is valuable from a scientific and environmental management perspective. This has a flow-on effect to industries including agriculture and forestry, and meteorological information obtained by space-based sensors allows for accurate weather prediction over a long time frame, which assists in emergency planning, agriculture and energy generation. All of these are vital national activities are enabled by space, making space a vital asset for Australia to defend its interests in. Defence relies extensively on the use of space-based systems in support of operations, which has been reflected by the inclusion of space considerations in all previous defence white papers to 1987. Space-based systems are used by the Australian Defence Force for communication, navigation and timing, targeting, meteorological data, mapping and intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance. The ADF's ability to conduct military operations has been greatly enhanced through our access to space. Our ability to coordinate the actions of a number of different platforms, ships, aircrafts, land task forces, over long distances relies extensively on space-based systems. For example, prior to the widespread use of space by the military, Australian Defence Force operations in the Vietnam War relied on terrestrial high-frequency radio communications, which were influenced by a number of environmental factors and not always guaranteed. Navigation was conducted by map and compass, while targeting and battle damage assessments for air-to-surface weapons were done from the ground or by reconnaissance aircraft, and strikes were usually conducted using unguided or primitively guided munitions. Were this conflict to have occurred in an environment where use of space was more advanced, soldiers would have had access to more reliable satellite communications and navigation. Airstrikes would have been far more precise due to the use of precision-guided munitions. Another example of a recent conflict where military forces could have benefited from greater access to space assets is the Falklands War between Britain and Argentina. For example, the first of a series of British air raids attacking Port Stanley airfield using unguided bombs from Vulcan bombers only managed one direct hit on the runway despite the use of over 20 munitions. Despite the bombing efforts the airfield was subsequently still available for use by Argentine transport planes bringing in supplies. The improved accuracy and all-weather capability of GPS-guided munitions would most likely have resulted in more direct strikes on the runway, making it unusable by the Argentinian Air Force. Today, Joint Direct Attack Munitions, or JDAMs, commonly used by Australia and allied countries, has an accuracy of less than 13 metres with GPS guidance. The smallest current runway at Port Stanley Airfield is 13 metres wide. For today's Australian Defence Force, satellite communication enables deployed forces to maintain real-time contact with Australia and each other in order to more effectively coordinate actions and effects. The ADF has access to space-based intelligence, mapping and meteorological capabilities to aid in mission planning, global positioning aids in navigation and targeting, and munitions equipped with sophisticated guidance systems, often including GPS positional and timing data to increase accuracy and reduce the effects of poor visibility, are used extensively for precision strikes. Access to space saves lives in a conflict. For example, precision targeting enabled by precision-guided munitions avoids civilian casualties from strikes. Accurate navigation and reliable communication enable faster medical evacuations during the critical golden hour for a casualty, and improved reconnaissance and ISR capabilities help friendly forces avoid ambushes and improvised explosive device attacks, something that we used extensively in Afghanistan. Today's Australian Defence Force is highly networked, and we're increasingly making efforts to improve our ability to fight a joint war in order to achieve a coordinated effect that is greater than the sum of its parts. Satellite communication is essential to this capability. Australia and Defence's increasing reliance on space makes security and stability of the space domain a vital national interest. Australia is reliant on payloads attached, as well as access to space-based systems operated by our allies. The level of access to the capabilities provided by foreign operated systems is controlled by the operating government and is therefore vulnerable to competing priorities for access or diverging national interests. Having established our reliance on space assets, I'll now discuss some of the threats that we face in maintaining our access to these systems. Assured access to space is threatened by natural events such as solar flares, collision risks from man-made space debris, a crowded electromagnetic spectrum, strong competition for orbital positions, and hostile actions from foreign parties. Space debris, pieces of material often moving at very high speed left in space as a result of human activities, collisions between space objects, or the destruction of space objects, pose a collision and therefore damage or destruction risk to satellite constellations and the networks of which they are essential components. It is estimated, and we've discussed the numbers here already, that there are over 500,000 pieces of space debris of a size large enough to identify currently in orbit. As orbital space becomes more and more crowded, the risk of collision increases, leading to the possibility of a catastrophic chain reaction of collisions, which could leave so much debris in orbit as to make space unfeasible for generations. Environmental conditions or space weather poses a risk to space operations, and potentially damaging events can occur with very little warning and with limited mitigation measures available. Events such as solar flares and coronal mass ejections could disrupt communications between satellites and ground facilities, damage or interfere with sensitive electronics contained in the satellites themselves, or expose persons operating in space to unsafe levels of radiation. Space-based communication and broadcasting systems rely on assured access to electromagnetic bandwidth in order to operate effectively. As the costs associated with access to space decrease and space becomes increasingly crowded, access to electromagnetic bandwidth will become more competitive and regulation of electromagnetic spectrum will remain vital. Defence is also concerned by counter-space activities, which have the potential to impact our access to space. Counter-space activities refer to the ability to destroy a space object, damage a space object, or otherwise prevent it from achieving its required function. Counter-space actions reduce the confidence that countries place in their access to space-based systems and hinders stability in space. Counter-space operations that are kinetic or destructive in nature have the potential to create debris clouds, which, as stated previously, increase the risk of collision and damage to other satellites. Many counter-space operations may be considered as unfriendly or as even hostile acts by the affected party, resulting in a possible escalation to conflict in the terrestrial domain. Space-related technologies with the potential to ease the cost of access to space and increase the lifespan of orbiting systems continue to advance. Advances being made in the field of space propulsion, such as the use of electromagnetic propulsion, satellite lifespan, including more capable batteries and more durable components, and reliability. Component miniaturisation is leading to the mass production of so-called CubeSats, And importantly, lower production and launch costs will lead to proliferation of such satellites and make it easier for states and non-state entities, such as commercial businesses, to invest in a space capability. In addition, technical advances in counter-space weapons development will also further complicate the security of the space environment and the degree of confidence with which nations can rely on their use of space. Australia needs to be able to maintain our use of space in the face of these challenges and continue to reap the benefits that it provides. Access to space-based systems has provided Defence with a great technical advantage, which is critical to achieving our mission. However, our dependency could also be our most critical vulnerability. As part of efforts to increase our resilience, Defence needs to be able to operate in an environment where its access to space is either not assured or significantly degraded. Alternate means of communication need to be used where possible, and conducting training exercises simulating a space-denied environment provides a valuable opportunity to improve overall operations and assess the effects of the loss of space of capability. It could also lead to a mutiny among soldiers who are forced to use a compass and a map again. Defence is also building our space capabilities. Australia currently contributes to US Space Situational Awareness, reducing the risk of collision in space, through the basing of a C-band radar and space surveillance telescope on our territory. The C-band radar I got to play with remotely today. We're also growing our space cadre within the Defence Force to support those assets. Australia can contribute to a more robust space network by building redundancy into our systems, promoting global norms and the peaceful use of space, and developing technologies to make assets less vulnerable to counter-space weapons. Diplomatic efforts to establish universally adhered to rules and norms relating to the use of space, such as through the United Nations treaties and principles on outer space, are vital to ensuring stability in space, resolve disputes and allow fair access to space for all nations. Australia has and will continue to have a strong reliance on space systems for civil and military use, a dependence on commercial and allied infrastructure and a limited Indigenous space capability. Going forward, Defence will continue to maintain our awareness of developments in space and counter-space technologies and develop Australian technical expertise to support our continued access to space capabilities. We're not the only country or military who is deeply reliant on access to space. We're working with our allies to ensure the robustness of the systems that we use, while concurrently planning for the possibility of having to operate and work in a degraded or denied space environment. By continuing to maintain an understanding of the environment, remaining up to date with emerging technologies in the field and developing a more robust space network in partnership with our allies, Australia will be well placed to continue to enjoy the benefits provided by access to space, such as a cold beer at the Maree pub. So thank you very much for your attention. Look forward to your questions later in the presentation.
Thank you. Actually, I'll give a little commercial here. The Arthur C. Clarke Foundation just produced a video that's on YouTube. Write this down, and it basically says, if there were a day without satellites. It's only 3 minutes long, and it unfortunately gives you a very frightening picture of what could happen with a major coronal mass ejection. You know, we hear a lot about asteroids and asteroid dangers, but NASA has just done a study where they said that there's a 12% chance of a very major solar storm. And there's a difference. Radiation is radiation, but a coronal mass ejection, that's mass, and that can do a whole lot of damage. And that in 1859, there was something called the Carrington event. And when that happened, the telegraph offices caught on fire, and a whole lot of things. We could see the northern lights all the way down to Cuba and Hawaii. If that event occurred today, it would probably wipe out our power systems and wipe out a lot of our satellites and so on. So we really are vulnerable. And the other thing is our defense system, which actually is our electromagnetic shield that forms the Van Allen belts, are changing. We have problems. We can get back to this question and answers, but the bottom line here is we really are vulnerable to these solar storms, and that a whole lot of our communications, our navigation, our weather satellites, these are all vital today. So if you have a chance, go online. Maybe I'll show it later in the week, this 3-minute video of a day without satellites. So just to reinforce what you were talking about. And our last speaker tonight is someone I think known to a lot of you. I've met him, I guess, three or four times since I've been to Australia for various ISU events. Brett Biddington is the founder of the Canberra-based consulting company, which specializes in space and cybersecurity matters from a policy, advocacy, and national capacity development perspective. He is the director of the Space Environmental Research Center and the Australian Cybersecurity Research Institute Limited. He's also the director of the treasurer of the Institute for Regional Security, a Canberra-based think tank. And most recently, through the efforts of Michael Davis and Brett, the International Astronautical Congress is going to be meeting here in Adelaide in 2017, and Brett is basically heading up that entire operation where 5,000 space scientists and engineers will descend upon Adelaide. So it's a really big coup, I think, for Adelaide, and Michael and Brett, you deserve a lot of credit for making that happen. So anyway, Brett, tell us.
Thanks, Joe. Ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me? All good. Now I've got to try to make this thing work. Let's see if we can do that. How do I get out of... Oh, it's sitting up there, hidden behind that. We can do it that way, can we? There's that one out. That's that one. Oh, there we are. That's it. That's back to front, but that's all right. We can start there. Here we are. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard this before. I want to take a slightly different angle on this. In Australia, the Commonwealth Attorney General is responsible for critical infrastructure protection. In Australia, almost all of our critical infrastructure is privately owned. And one of the problems and challenges, therefore, that we have is how to provide intelligence about threats. Not on? I thought it was. Maybe it is. Is how to provide... Is that better? How to provide information about threats that might come to our attention through the intelligence community and therefore classified material. How do you make that available to the operators of our critical infrastructure? There's been a study done in the last 12 months about the role of space and of satellites within our critical infrastructure. And basically, the conclusion of that study is that satellites are vital to several of the areas that we've broken our critical infrastructure in sharing arrangements down into: transport and communications, banking and finance, food and agriculture, and energy. The only critical infrastructure that doesn't really have a fundamental dependency on satellites is health. And again, that really depends on where you draw lines. But supra doesn't apply to Australia, it applies to every single country around the world. So we're dealing here with global issues. I showed this slide earlier today in a talk I gave to the students, but we need to think about space as a system with ground components, with ways of communicating to satellites and for them to communicate back to us. And there's both a physical component of that, which is the electromagnetic spectrum, and then there's a cyber component to that, the data that flows up and down the electromagnetic spectrum between satellites and the ground. And any one of those can present a weak link. And the question, therefore, is not just how you worry about what's happening in the space domain, as you've heard from our two previous speakers. That's challenging enough. But if we can take a system out much more easily by simply knocking out some ground facilities that have not been properly made redundant or that have not been made properly and adequately resilient, then why go to the bother of inventing a space weapon? So it's really, really important to look at system complexity and understand system complexity when dealing with these security issues. That's the only point I want to make with regard to this slide. Size matters in terms of what Australia can do. A couple of figures there, 24 million or so versus about 320 in the United States, for example, still the world's largest economy. The Australian population is about that of the state of New York. And the reason I put this slide up is to basically ask and, in a sense, put it out there as a question: what do you think, what can we expect a nation of the same size geographically of the United States, in this example, what can we expect that population to do, given that it's relatively speaking so small? We have to still have a road that runs across the continent, and railways and airports and hospitals and schools, but across a massive distance. So the infrastructure costs just for that physical infrastructure to run this nation are somewhat more expensive per head, and some things have to give. And this might go some way to explaining why Australia has not invested as much in the space domain as certainly some would hope that we would have done and might do in the future, certainly in the civil and the commercial sectors. Another element here is that in this country there has been an absolute bifurcation between the classified uses and commitments we've made to space, going back to the days of Britain at Woomera and coming through to places like Pine Gap in Central Australia and our alliance with the United States. And I can assure you that that single facility is absolutely central in terms of the relationship that we have with the United States, because of its importance both to America and to us. So size matters, and that leads to strategic decisions and choices having to be made. That's only the point that I want to make here. Whether we've made the right or the wrong choices, or what choices we might make in the future, given the sort of technology changes that others have talked about, really important challenges for us. There's a hierarchy, in my view, of nations with respect to space. These are the nations that, and this is the way that I would split this up. At the moment, I see the United States and China in front of this. Russia, I've relegated to a second tier, still very important. There can be argument and discussion about this, and so there should be. Russia still launched more satellites, or had more space launches last year than did either the United States or China. There's an article apparently in today's media saying that the Russians are about to reduce significantly their commitment to their space program because they're running out of money. And indeed, if that's the case, and I haven't had an opportunity to verify it, I would suggest to you, given the parlous state of the global economy, that China and the United States will not be far behind in their civil programs. Their military and national security programs will continue unimpeded. Such is the importance of space as the high ground for diplomacy and for warfare. That blue group of countries are the countries that are all in some way or another spacefaring, pretty close to it, have important or useful capabilities. They don't have nuclear weapons. I think that's with the exception perhaps of Iran. That of course distinguishes them from most of the countries above, if not all, except Japan above. So you can begin to see that there's also a nexus in the way that the history of human access to space has gone. There's a DNA helix between developments in nuclear capabilities and developments in missile capabilities that are used to launch nuclear weapons. And all of these sort of capabilities are dual use. That is, the launcher, whether it's a missile, bucket of sunshine going from country A to country B, or whether it's a meteorological satellite, it still needs a massive rocket to get it going fast enough not to fall back to Earth. My last slide is this slide. It's just another way of thinking about the world and thinking about where the money is. There's a very strong correlation, like it's direct, between the spacefaring nations and the Northern Hemisphere. You can see that I've displaced the equator here, north or south, depending on your point of view, to the Tropic of Cancer. But the capital cities of all of the major spacefaring nations are north of the Tropic of Cancer, and that's also where most of the people live. There are actually more countries south of the Tropic of Cancer than there are north, as you can see by my slide, but also more people live in the top third of the world than in the bottom 2/3 or so. So we need to think about the disposition of money, the disposition of our geographies, when we come to understand and think about the sorts of things that a country like Australia, small or medium power, take your pick, what does it really mean? It's a description simply to say we're not a great power, but what can a country like Australia sensibly, realistically do that other countries can't do, that can assist to make space assured and secure for us all? There's no immediate answer to that, or there are many possible answers. One answer is simply to put our head in the sand, hope to God that the United States will sort this out on our behalf. Is that a good response? I don't personally think so, but on the other hand, they are our ally, and $2 of every $3 spent in space is spent by the United States. We could really simply abrogate responsibility. Is that the way that we should behave as a nation or not? Not to me to say, but to many others. But before we can have the conversation, we need some base knowledge, and hopefully we've given you some of that tonight. And my last slide, of course, is then to give the advertisement to say on these days next year, we hope to have, Joe, I wish it were 5,000. It'll be hopefully 3,000 or 3,500 people, typically, in Adelaide for a week. This will include in the order of 20 astronauts. That's about the number of astronauts who come to this event or who have flown from various countries over the years. We'll have heads of space agencies, the major space agencies. We'll have, I hope, major political interest, not just from Australia but from other countries as well. And it really is a meeting of the minds. 30 separate tracks for papers, that sort of number, space law through to space medicine and launch and goodness knows what else, everything in between. And it's also a very important set of birthdays next year. 2017 is the 60th anniversary of the launch of Sputnik. Now just think about that. Ray Williamson's buzzing bees around the Earth, there was only one of those before 1957, and that was the moon. Then there were 2, then there were 3, and now what grubs we are as a species. So the question is, how do we start to tidy this up? So the first birthday is Sputnik. The second birthday that matters is it's the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Outer Space Treaty, which is the basic law of space. It's the 50th anniversary of the launch of RESAT, Weapons Research Establishment Satellite, which was Australia's first satellite to be launched from Australian soil, and only 2 have been launched from Australian soil, both from Woomera. And we just heard earlier today that it's something like the 40th anniversary of the birthday for the International Space University. So I was talking earlier today to one of the traditional owners of the land here, one of our Ghana people, and I said to him that earlier again today I'd talked to the Adelaide Symphony Orchestra and said, we are certainly going to have the birthday song at the opening ceremony, so please come to it. Thank you.
So I'd like to invite all of our distinguished panelists to come up. I'd like to quickly get to the audience question, but I'd like to pose just one question in terms of trade-offs and hard choices and difficult choices. That I mentioned earlier that there may be as many as 1 million of these marble-sized debris elements by 2020. And you might say, well, a marble size, that's not that important, is it? Well, no, that is very much like a very large grenade or a small bomb when it hits the satellite, and enough to take out a critical subsystem. And the question is, what do we do about that kind of debris element? There's a proposal from Japan, from the Riken Institute, that says we could put a high-powered laser up on the International Space Station, and that could ablate these small things so that they come down. And they said that at least in that critical polar orbit is pointing to, that they could take care of all of those marble-sized systems within 5 years. Now, that's just a projection. But the point is, and the tough choice is, we have something called the Outer Space Treaty, and that says you don't put weapons in space. And the issue is, on one hand, we need to clean up space and to sustain space, but it looks like the only way that's cost-effective and reasonable to do it might be to put something up there that looks and seems very much like a space weapon. So I'm just going to toss it out to the three of you to say, what do we do? Do we put these things up and all agree that it's not a space weapon? Or what do we do to solve this kind of problem? So.
Well, let me take a stab at that. The first thing is that it clearly needs to be international. I'm working on a report for the International Academy of Astronautics right now, and we're looking at the policy issues, the legal issues, and so forth for taking debris out of space. And it's true that virtually any method that you've got that you can think of to remove debris from space could be considered a space weapon. After all, there were concerns that the space shuttle, which went up, did things in space and came back down, and it landed in the United States, that it could be used as a space weapon, taking other objects out of space. So it's a big issue, and I don't have an answer to it. I'm hoping that our study, when we're completed, will have some ideas for those. But it still has to be an international agreement, because no country wants to look on and see another country take one of their objects out of space. So with that,
So at least one insight is that to make this happen, it would have to be kind of an international consortium doing it together rather than one country trying to do it alone.
I think so.
I know Brett has some interesting ideas that he'll talk about well, letting someone else, the country that's having their satellite removed, be at the controls. So I know you'll get to that. But anyway, Tyson.
Look, I'm conscious this is a public event and don't want it to appear on the front page of the Advertiser tomorrow that senior defence official supports Japanese space laser. But I would agree that any solution has to be multilateral. If we look at how we have guaranteed the safety and security of other domains, and the maritime and air domains spring to mind, they have been done through international agreements and broad understanding of the importance of freedom of navigation in the maritime domain or in the air domain. And in space, as in those terrestrial domains, I think international agreements to govern their use and to have broad international consensus on the means and manner by which you mitigate debris in space, and whether that be through use of tools that could be a weapon, but we've all decided that for this particular purpose they're not, with safeguards in place that could include the use of said tool by the state whose asset is being removed or threatened. I think there are ways in which we can do that, as we've solved complex security concerns in other domains such as air and maritime.
So the phrase I use is that your garbage truck's my space weapon, and there's no way to avoid that. But I do remind you that dynamite is used in mines every day. They're called bombs if they're used by the military, or IEDs or whatever. So this is not beyond the wit and reason of man to resolve. The technology or technologies, if they don't exist today, they are very close to existing, as Joe has pointed out. It's rather a question of will, and right now the three major spacefaring nations are not prepared, or put another way, they each have a different risk calculus. The United States is more dependent for its national security on satellites than are either Russia or China. That's changing. It would help. One of the objects of the West would be to make China in particular as dependent on satellites as the Americans are. At that point, the cost to China of tolerating a situation where a collision in low Earth orbits is approaching certainty, at that point there is you will see that they will come to the table. But that calculation is not yet to that point, and Russia also is making a different calculation. Both those countries are terrified that the United States is going to put weapons in space. It doesn't actually make a lot of sense to put weapons in space. That's another conversation we can have. But they're terrified that that will happen, and so they're keeping their options open, which is why they propose a treaty regime, whereas the United States and the West are saying, we don't want to be tied up with a treaty regime. We want rather something that is less than that, but is nonetheless binding through rules of agreement, rules of the road, trust and confidence building measures, so something less than a formal treaty, but gives us a lot more flexibility. I would make one final point, which is that I think that we need in the 21st century to recast our whole thinking about space. I think that within 10 years, a lot of satellites are going to be out of favour, because countries will realise that they can meet many of their national security objectives, not all, but many, by using all sorts of robotic unmanned aerial vehicles, which they control, they have sovereign access over, and they therefore, now in some respects this might make the spectrum problem, it sort of displaces it into another area, but I think that we could well see that this problem will resolve itself to some extent at least, because people will find they're less reliant on satellites in the future than they are today.
I'd just like to add one point to the last point you made, which is few people realize that the synchronization of the internet internationally is achieved through the GPS system.
Correct.
And if the GPS system went down, we would probably lose the internet within a few hours.
But on the other hand...
Well, just to finish, there are some countries like the UK who's basically said, no, we're going to go to a ground-based system. So that's just one indication that of what you're saying, there may be some rethinking. There's one other issue that we didn't touch on, and I'd like to throw it out, and then we'll go to the audience, I promise. And that is a major thing has happened in terms of space and space exploration in the last few months. In November, the United States passed a new law called the Space Act of 2015, but Title 4 about how we could go up, get resources from space and bring it down, and that somehow this was legal, and it was also consistent with the U.S. obligations under the Outer Space Treaty and presumably the Moon Treaty, even though the U.S. has not signed on to that. So I would like a little bit of discussion about other things that could, if you will, lead to conflict in space, and that the response to the U.S. adopting this law has not been universal agreement or thinking that this was a good idea. And there's two things that can happen. One is that a lot of people will sign on to the Moon Treaty and this will become a big issue. The other one is that a lot of countries may say, well, if the U.S. can do it, we can do it, and they will pass very similar laws out there. To what extent do you think space mining issues will become an issue of dispute and contention, and maybe even more than that in the years ahead? How do you see that playing out? maybe we'll start this way, not let the
Okay,
US go first.
so mining on Earth, let's just start there for a minute. Something like 70% of all the steel used in the United States is recycled. The mining boom that made Australia rich a few years ago is not going to come back, because China has almost now got a critical mass of metal in concrete that in the next 30 years will just recycle. So this notion of digging up more and more stuff on Earth is a bit of bullshit. And
Scientific term.
And I think we're going to see similar sorts happen in space. I mean, the economics to me just don't stack up.
Share the view. I don't think it's an imminent economic issue. We have a treaty system governing Antarctica that currently prevents mining. Australia has a claim on Antarctica for the Australian Antarctic Territory, and whilst that claim is only recognised by, I think, 5 other countries, there is a difference in opinion about Australia's status in Antarctica, along with France and Norway and the UK, compared to the US position, Chinese position, Chilean position. And yet we have maintained the Antarctic Treaty System and a moratorium on mineral extraction in Antarctica. If we can do it there, where it's more imminent and more possible, I'm unconcerned strategically that this will be an issue in the near term.
Well, frankly, there's a question of the viability of that law and its relationship to the Outer Space Treaty and the other agreements, and well, especially the Moon Agreement. So I suspect that it won't be a big issue for a while. We'll see. If it gets taken up as a major issue within the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space in the UN, then we may need to rethink that whole question. But until that happens, I don't think there'll be some people, especially in the legal community,
Joe, can I just add that
dealing with this, but not general, more general.
I think it was the state of Illinois passed a law once that defined pi as 3.1.421.
I thought it was Tennessee,
period,
but that's
or
okay.
what doesn't matter. From an outsider's perspective, this is yet another great example of the rich tapestry of the US legislative system at work. And we just sort of leave it at that in mystery. I mean, just look at the contenders for the presidency, and but I can say that as an Australian, right? And I don't expect a government official to be quoting or endorsing, right?
When you ask your question, why don't you just indicate who you are and maybe where are you an ISU student or somewhere in the community, Australian community, and ask whomever you wish. So who's going to start? If our ISU students don't have a question, we're in real trouble.
Questions, we can go home.
Come on.
We can go to the Moree pub.
There is a reception, but let's
I
not...
was thinking of.
Oh, go ahead.
Paul, wait a second. Yeah, we need the mic. Well, but this is being
Yes,
recorded.
It's being recorded. I should have noted this in advance, that it's being streamed to the ISU community, and anybody in the world could actually hear what you're going to say, Paul. So.
Talking about no pressure. Talking about space-based weapons and so on. What's happened to the old Star Wars program that was started by Reagan? Has the funding for that stopped? Is that something that's still going on?
Dead.
Of course.
There's actually a fair amount of money going into systems that relate to that, but that's all I can say about it.
For those of you who don't know, it's called the Strategic Defense System, and it was basically kind of an anti-satellite system. And as far as I know, its technology is being developed, but it's not being
Still going
implemented.
strong.
But you again can see the issue here, that the fact is that these sorts of weapons are being developed, not just by the United States, but by China and Russia and India, and none of them yet is confident that they've reached essentially some stable or some point of stability or sufficient instability, like mutually assured destruction in the Cold War, that they've got no option but to cooperate to sort this mess out. Until there is some recognition of parity, we will continue to have international negotiations essentially disrupted and not be able to be brought to a satisfactory conclusion. The issue is not the technology, it's the politics.
Can I add on that SDI, the Star Wars as it was known, raised concerns about weapon systems in space, that there would be objects in space that would be applying force to other objects, and there was concern about that, not only from the perspective, the destabilising element as that related to the doctrine of nuclear warfighting at the time, but also about the use of weapons in space. And it creates some interesting questions about the absence of international law governing military actions in space. So the use of force in space, we have some reasonably clear international law and agreements around, but it is worth defining, I think, as we build our technologies in a way that weren't envisaged by those original treaties, to look at how space can be fought through. So a joint direct attack munition that I mentioned in my presentation essentially has us fighting through space. We're using space in order to deploy that weapon system and have a kinetic result on Earth. And that raises some questions, some ethical questions, some legal questions that I don't think necessarily need to rule those activities out, but it is an area that defence and government are interested in, about regulating military law in outer space.
I would just like to add that there are people doing research on what are called directed energy beam systems, and they have indicated that these are systems that could be used if it were necessary to deflect an asteroid in terms of planetary defense. So again, you have this issue of that space weapons on one hand, but also something that you might be able to use for orbital debris or for on a bigger scale, an asteroid. So it's always a problem, and always I think the answer comes back, you have to have international agreement that the UN has created a working group on same page, the Space Mission Planning Advisory Group. That's an international group that would basically say what could we do and how could we do it. So next question.
Thank you.
Where? You have to come down to ask the questions.
Hi guys, my name's Lisa. I'm ISU student. The United States has a regulation called the International Traffic and Arms Regulation, ITAR. I was wondering, do you guys think that this regulation is useful at all in stopping like space being used as a weapon, or is it just a waste of time?
Ray, you can handle that.
A lot of those regulations, which are very awkward to put into place, I mean, to actually to institute when you're building systems and trying to work internationally, they get in the way. And there are a number of people within the United States who would like to see the rules lightened up even more than they have been recently, so that there would be a freer flow of international commerce. The problem is that there's also another group of folks within the United States who, at both the higher level within Congress and at the mid-level, the people who actually make the decisions about what items are on this list and which aren't, who manage to slow things up, shall we put it, and prevent the trade in some of these items. My personal view is that the U.S. would be better off if that were much more open.
I'd just like to add that when we were at Intelsat, we would put out RFPs to do research, and we might find a U.S. firm that had the best proposal, but then none of our employees, which was international, could see the results. So we consistently never could give an R&D contract to a U.S. company.
And I think I'd like
and the other thing is just a speech, just a humorous, the president of the University of Maryland talking about ITAR, of saying about how it was so restrictive across so many different areas, sometimes almost trivial areas. And he said that, you know, if you protect your office supplies and diamonds with the same degree of rigor, you're going to lose a lot more diamonds and a lot less office supplies. Yeah. And it really is where ITAR is sort of like that. It covers way too many areas, and it should have focused on really critical military technologies.
But it's worth saying to an Australian audience that there is a very important implication for us. Some years ago, we signed a treaty with the United States which effectively extends the US ITAR boundary to the extent of Australian domestic jurisdiction. Now, what that means is that if we now have an Australian company that develops a great idea that's got any aspect of ITAR protected IP, intellectual property, in that idea that we want to then export to another country, we may be prevented from doing so because of that ITAR restriction that allows that to happen. That's the first thing. ITAR, and more particularly the Australian Act, which is called the Defence Trade Controls Act, doesn't just relate to goods, it also relates to ideas.
That's right.
It relates to a PowerPoint presentation and an email. An academic who shares an idea that is somehow or other related to our strategic goods list, which is derived in some respects from the ITAR, who then shares that idea with a person from a country with whom we are not friendly and we have not had authorisation to share that with, potentially goes to jail for 10 years. That's something that most academics in this country simply don't know, or they're in denial about. We've tried to educate them, but they say it won't happen to me, just like the wily hacker won't hack my... Let's grow up, folks. So you might think about this in the context of the recent innovation statement from our government. We're going to have this new palace of gems with all these innovators, and they're going to be exporting great Australian ideas all around the world, except in any one of the 350 pages of stuff in the Defence Restricted Goods List, which is controlled by the Department of Customs. ITAR, last point, ITAR is not a US Department of Defence owned and operated system. It's operated by the Department of State. And the point about this is that there are no such things as permanent friendships. There are only permanent interests when it comes to diplomacy between nations. So that's why the Mujahideen many years ago were sold, in fact given, Stinger missiles, despite the fact that they were ITAR protected. And they then, when the Americans were no longer friendly with the Mujahideen, those missiles were used against United States helicopters. So you've got to be really careful about this stuff because it can come back and bite you in the backside, literally.
Yes, please.
This is just following on from...
Wait, please.
So, sorry, Brett, I'm just following on from what you just said. I thought that they were looking at those, that ITAR policy in light of what you've just said, because there was a lot of protest from the academic community at the time. Has that not been modified? I thought they were doing that.
There's been a review and there's been a relaxation, but there's still very onerous laws and rules. More so than the US ITAR. Our academic and research community has stricter rules being applied to it than the United States applies to its own academics and its research organisations.
So some issues related to telecommunication satellites, for instance, have been moved to the Department of Commerce, and that's a much faster process.
Yeah.
Next slide.
We have another question over there, Christina.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Christina. I'm from ISU student. I would like to ask you, Brad, referring to your justification about the investment, the Australian investment in space, that it's not like should be because of several reasons, like a population of 24 million, priority in projects like a hospital to be the food people. You don't think that looking at a different prospect, investing more in space, you could approach the same project, you could find the fund that could help you to build hospital for the poor people, just investing more in the space and having also a technological project that you could make on disposal of the whole population, also educational project. And especially in this situation, if we can prove that with the satellite, we can have an economical return 3 times what is the initial investment. This means in a contract for industry, jobs for people, research. That is a step, I think, that could really help to make a progress, especially in this period that Australia is facing quite a crisis with the oil and gas, with the mining. Could be also an option to look to differentiate and invest a little bit more in a different sector.
So I think the question basically is, what can the southern hemisphere countries do more in space?
Yeah.
Both in terms of equipment and also services.
So job creation is what matters, and 21st century jobs look massively different to 20th century jobs, and we know that certainly in this state where car industry is closing, industrial manufacturing is reducing, and what is going to take its place. And increasingly, these are going to be jobs that require a very good understanding of science, technology, engineering and mathematics, and very different approaches to the way we teach people those topics. That means we need a different set of teachers. And then the jobs that are going to be done are jobs that in many cases haven't been invented yet, but they will be information-based jobs. So the people, if you have to a displaced workforce of hundreds of people out of a factory, you're not going to replace them by that same number of jobs if you're looking simply at launching satellites. We have to think about the ground applications in particular for the base of those new jobs that have got some spatial element to them. That's why I say think about this as a complex system and think about where unmanned aerial vehicles or unmanned vehicles and robotic vehicles will start to displace, because I think it's there are new markets, there are new capabilities, and space is a part, but only a part of this. And again, when you've got a limited set of budgets to worry about here, and also we want to export, because the Australian domestic market is too small to be able to sustain if we can only sell in Australia. And I come back then to the point that was made earlier about ITAR and our equivalent laws. Almost by definition, anything that we do as a nation to put stuff into space is going to have some sort of export restriction on it. That means in our case, we can export only back to the United States, perhaps to Europe, period. That is the reality of life. So if I'm an investor and I've got $10 to invest, where am I going to get my best return? Your point about 3 to 1 or 7 to 1, 8 to 1 for the Canadarm is a point well taken. But there are other industries too, and new industries emerging where that return is going to be much higher. And space, we really, really need to think hard about this. The way that we commonly talk about it, we are dealing with essentially a dinosaur industry. And that's really, really hard for us to get our heads around, because I'm actually, despite what I've just said, right now involved in trying to build a sensible space sector, particularly in South Australia, because there is an impetus and there is a need and there is a national need for us to have more than we have. But what that more should be is not what we think it was in the past. It's something different and new and disruptive and we haven't really imagined what that is yet.
We have time for one or two more questions. One short one, two short ones or one longer one. Yes.
Hi, good evening. Nicolas Assanelli from the state government. Just a question that has come from this last question. Do you think that the Australian Space Agency could be stimulate the industry, the national industry, and the research industry in the space sector?
Well, all I can say, that's not a new question, but let's hear what the panel has to say. What's the current thinking?
I think a lot of these things need to be market-driven rather than agency-driven. We're blessed in Australia with some geography that makes support to space operations and space activity an easy reality for us. We're not Singapore or somewhere with a small amount of geography. We've got some good latitudes and open spaces that lets us do a lot of things, and we're doing that in terms of space situational awareness activities. There's a range of activities that are being proposed for places like Woomera, both in support of military technologies and civil academic technologies. I think it has to be the actions of the market that determine whether or not we're going to have a viable space industry. I don't think the creation of an agency and having that seed funded to a degree is necessarily going to be the impetus required. Looking at the way in which the trajectory for the transformative effects of space, if cheap space lift is a technology that can be mastered in the near future, that could be, I think, the transformative moment, and that's where research and private sector investment, and we're seeing that through SpaceX and a range of other companies. If that can be cracked, that's your ticket, I think, and that's a private sector research-based thing rather than says the bureaucrat, a bureaucratic solution to try and stimulate. I don't think, unless the investment is massive, as it was for NASA in the 60s, that government is going to be the vehicle by which this develops.
Okay.
Personal opinion.
So I'd say three things. Firstly, why do you need a space agency? What would it do that we presently don't do? And the answer is, it's really hard to find an answer to that. Some say, well, we would have better coordination. We actually have good coordination, just that the rest of the world doesn't believe us. And that's because we haven't told the rest of the world actually how we do that coordination very effectively. But you simply need to go to www.space.gov.au, and that's your entry point to civil and commercial space from a regulatory point of view in this country. The Space Activities Act, which is owned by the Department of Industry and Innovation, is presently in the process of being reviewed and updated. We didn't need a space agency to see that had to happen. My last point would be, and this is a bureaucratic point, but it's an important one. When governments get short of money, they apply the Broad Acts to organisations. By definition, an Australian space agency would have in the order of 50 people to start off with. When the 10% cut comes across government, that means that the 10% out of the Department of Defence that gets cut and nobody notices it, actually they do, but that's sort of the joke, 10% makes a 50-person agency simply inoperative. And a good example is, some years ago, there was a cut made across the board, including to the Australian War Memorial. And so the director wrote to the Prime Minister and said, I'll be shutting on Sundays. Well, that didn't last for long, because the veterans have to be able to go and see the War Memorial on Sundays. So I want to make the point here that bureaucratically, small agencies, in the way that we have structured our government, are really, really vulnerable.
Yeah.
What we need to be thinking about more carefully, I think, Nicola, is how we make a better fist of informing ourselves as a nation and the world of actually how we've organised this stuff. It's not been helped by the bifurcation between the classified world that goes back to the Woomera days of the 1940s and the complete lack of relationship between the very significant and considerable work that's gone on in the classified domain for 70 or 80 years versus what happens in the official domains. There's a narrative that's missing, and that's one of the reasons we're bidding for this conference. Well, we won the bid, that's why we're holding the conference, to try to help promote a national narrative to create a much bigger ecosystem or infrastructure so that we can address the question that was asked earlier about why don't you go for that 3-for-1 ratio advantage. There's some missing bigger pieces here, and the Space Agency is not one of those big pieces in my view.
Ray, you have a final comment?
Yeah, I just have noticed how this conversation started with being concerns about debris and in orbit and so forth, and we've come around once again in Australia to talking about jobs and whether there should be an Australian space program and so forth and so on. It's an interesting conversation, and I want to thank my colleagues who contributed to that, and the questions in the audience, because I thought they were really good questions for us.
So I want to close. We're having a reception immediately after to thank all of our panelists and the questions that you ask. I do think that we will have a chance to discuss this further this coming week, but particularly to thank Ray Williamson, Tyson Sarah, and Brett Biddington for their excellent presentations. So. Drinks?
Thank you, Joe. Thanks for doing that.
Pleasure meeting you.
Thank you, Rain.
And what if a major solar storm hit Earth? Because the protective magnetic field around the world seems to be weakening, the impact of a solar blast could be substantially worse than that sustained by the Carrington event of 1859. What could occur if a massive solar storm containing billions of ions blasted our planet, knocking out most of our satellites and zapping our power grids? Consider a day without satellites. In Paris, many people noticed the loss of TV satellite news and international sporting events. And in London, the GPS satellites that assist aircraft landing, even through dense clouds, fail, meaning all flights had to be diverted. In Washington, D.C., the failure of secure satellite communication systems at the Pentagon leaves soldiers, ships, and aircraft cut off from their command centers. Was this a nuclear attack? No one knows. Chinese fishermen near Hong Kong find their satellite phones no longer work. Well offshore in the China Sea, they are completely cut off from the mainland. In rural India, where most banking is accomplished by satellite communicating ATM machines, farming villagers can no longer access their money. And in Rio de Janeiro, electronic fund transfer systems have shut down. Banking systems all around the world start to fail. In Mexico City, access to the internet has been completely lost. In fact, around the world, internet has become inaccessible. This is because it's synchronized by signals from global positioning satellites. Once GPS goes down, the World Wide Web goes down only a few hours afterward. The full economic, educational, healthcare, transportation, and vital infrastructure impacts are now being realized. Billions are affected as the shutdown inhibits weather forecasting, government and defense communication, as well as disaster recovery. The day without satellites and power due to the massive solar storm has overwhelmed the world. For the rest of the week, power grids are gradually brought back online, satellite navigation and communication systems are recovered, and new replacement satellites are launched. Replacement transformers are rapidly installed, traffic signals, water, and sewage systems are also brought back. Internet service is slowly restored, and transportation systems begin running again. Warfare and major crime waves have been averted, and things may be getting back to normal. But had the massive solar explosion of ions been worse, recovery might have taken months rather than days, bringing humanity to its knees. The global economy might have shut down for months. The human and financial losses devastating. People depending on transport for food could have starved. Our world, as we know it, destroyed.